Okay, hello everyone. Looks like we still have some people filing into the room, which is exciting. We had hundreds of people sign up for this today, so I'm going to give a couple moments here to let the attendance list stabilize before we get things going. But I just wanted to say thanks to everybody who's shown up so far for coming in, and we'll get things going here momentarily. All right. Well, it seems like things are kind of leveling off a little bit. So, because we want to use your time as well as we can and use that of our guests as well as we can, I think we're going to get things going. So, my name is Charles Eldermeyer. I'm the BirdCams project leader at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I'm super excited today to bring all of you the opportunity to have a conversation with two people who are very closely involved in the California Condor Recovery Project. So during the next hour or so, we'll be talking with them about condors and the recovery project and the answers to a lot of your questions. So speaking of which, questions. Before we get started, I wanted to take a minute and just walk through a couple of the parts of this webinar format of Zoom that you may or may not be familiar with, because it's a little bit different than going to a Zoom meeting. So if you look at the Zoom toolbar, which is usually down at the bottom of your Zoom window, even though they change things a lot, you'll see that there's something called a Q&A, and you can click there to submit your questions. And those will form like a big queue of questions that we'll hopefully be able to work our way through as many of as we can. Now, with hundreds of you here, we're not going to be able to make it through every single question, but we'll do our best. There is closed captioning available, so you should be able to turn that on via your toolbar at the bottom as well. If you have any technical issues, we're not using the chat for that today because we have a small team working on this, but you can email birdcams@cornell.edu and we'll try and help you with that. And speaking of which, Ben Walters, the BirdCams communications specialist, is working behind the scenes of the webinar to both deal with your technical support issues and helping with answering questions and serving up some of the cool media we're going to get to watch today. And then finally, we always get questions about recording. Is there going to be a recording? A friend of mine couldn't make it today, that kind of thing. We're hoping to send out a recording of this in the next week once we get it cleaned up following the end of this webinar today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our two Condor experts that are joining us today. Nadya Seal-Faith, who's a conservation and science associate at the Santa Barbara Zoo, and Arianna Punzalan, who's supervisory wildlife biologist at the Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge, which is part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So welcome, you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I thought before we kick things off with all things Condor, people might appreciate just knowing a little bit about how you got to where you are today, being a Condor expert, a Condor biologist, working with some of these incredibly rare birds. And so Arianna, do you want to take a crack at letting people know who you are and how you got here?
Yeah, sure. So I'm from California, born and raised, was from Sacramento and did my undergrad at UC Santa Cruz. And I always knew I wanted to work with endangered species and work out in the field. So as I was getting close to graduating, I was just applying to every opportunity I could. And I was lucky enough to land a gig with the Pinnacles National, then Monument, Condor program as an intern. And this was 10 years ago. So I've been here working with the condors for quite a while now. I stayed with the Condor program at Pinnacles up until 2017, and then did some grad work at Colorado State University, predicting condor range expansion in California. And then lo and behold, timing worked out, and I'm here now working for the Fish and Wildlife Service with the Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge Complex. Still loving the job and getting to be outside as much as I can, but more so at a desk than anything else, but still working for the condors.
It's always the joy of moving up. Sometimes you don't get to spend as much time in the field. And just so folks out there, if your screen is looking anything like mine, Arianna, her video isn't quite as smooth as sometimes looks like we're having maybe just a slight thing. So it's not just you if you are experiencing it, or maybe it's just me, which is also entirely possible. But I didn't want you to feel like you're seeing something off at home. We'll see if we can figure out what's going on. And if not, at least your audio is coming through perfectly, Ariana. So thank you for that. And you said you've been working there for 10 years. Is that right?
Yes,
So how
exactly.
long do condors live? If you've been working on condors for 10 years, how much of an average condor's lifespan have you been working on
Oh
condors?
man, just a sliver. Condors can live a long time. We think, 70 plus years.
Holy cow. Yes, and oh, and so you mentioned the Hopper Complex. I'll just call it the Hopper Mountain Complex. Where is that in California? So we already started to get some questions about, wait, where is this?
Yeah, that's a good question. We are in Southern California. Our office is based out of the beautiful Ventura County, and Hopper Mountain is also in Ventura County, just north of Fillmore. It's a very small town off the 126 by Magic Mountain. And then we have another refuge where we release condors over in Kern County.
Great. So that gives people a sense. So Southern California is pretty much where the bulk of what we're going to be talking about today happens, right? You guys are managing the southern part of the condors. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So just to orient the audience. And then Nadya, not everybody maybe thinks of the Santa Barbara Zoo when they think of condors. So how's all that fit together with your life? How'd you get there?
Yeah, well, for one, I mean, condors right there on our logo. So I don't know why people wouldn't think about condors when they think about the zoo. But no, I have a slightly similar but slightly different track than Ariana for how I got here on the screen with her today. I graduated from just down south of here, UCLA, and I knew that I wanted to work with animals and with so many people, I just kind of assumed that the veterinary route was going to be for me. So I started off work in a veterinary office, and my husband is actually born and raised in Fillmore. So I was living with him at the time, and he, I kind of told him like, I don't know if the veterinary route is really where I want to go. And he's like, well, there's these things, there's condors, and I see these people pointing, these antennas at them. Maybe that's something that you could look into. So actually on my lunch break, I went over to the Fish and Wildlife Service office and I said, hey, I don't know that I want to do the veterinary thing. What's going on with these condors? I'm like, well, there's an internship. And so about 10 years ago, I signed up as an intern for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the condors have basically taken over my life since then. I was an intern with Fish and Wildlife Service for a while. I really liked the field work. I really liked getting out there. I missed a little bit of the hands-on animal experience that I had with the veterinary office. So the LA Zoo was actually having a keeper class going on right as my internship ended. So it's like, hey, let's check out the LA Zoo. They've been a part of the Condor program. So I did a keeper class with them. Wanted to see what other types of zoo work was available. So I started volunteering with the Santa Barbara Zoo, and just like the condors, they got their hooks in me, and I've been with the zoo ever since. It started out as a keeper aide for the upper bird line, including the condors, and then the position of nest technician opened up. And after a few years, the position that I'm currently in as the associate opened up. And so I was fortunate enough to be in there for the past 5 or so years. The great thing about what the Santa Barbara Zoo is able to do is we really like to focus on local conservation. California is just such a breadbasket of biodiversity. We're one of the top, biodiversity hotspots in the world. And so the Santa Barbara Zoo thought, if we're going to integrate conservation into our mission, we want to make sure that we're taking care of our backyard species first. And so the California Condor is actually one of the programs that we really channel and focus a lot of our conservation efforts towards, not only just resources, but also staff time. We have 2 full-time staff members dedicated for the program, and actually, well, kind of 3 now, and then 2 that's kind of part-time focus. I also feel fortunate that we can work with all other conservation species like island foxes, monarch butterflies, red-legged frogs, western snowy plovers, all that good stuff. So
That sounds
really,
amazing.
really happy to be here.
Sounds like a great backyard to be working in for sure.
It
Uh,
is. It is.
so one thing about our audience, we're really lucky actually to be pulling not only from the audience of people that are watching the Condor Cam, which has been going on now for over 5 years, I think. Um, and some of those people know a lot about what's happening in those condor cavities and have learned a lot about condors over the years. But there are people from all across kind of the internet who are here today. And I wondered, Arianna, if you might want to give folks an introduction to like condors and like why are we talking about condors? Because I don't know, I grew up during the time when condors really were the icon of what the conservation movement was moving towards. And so people might not know what a condor even looks like, and people might not know like the legendary kind of epic status of this conservation program. So would you mind giving folks a little bit of introduction? Because I think we'll cut to the chase on a lot of the curiosity that people have right off the bat, which I think would be great before we dive into kind of some of the more specific stuff that's happening on the Condor Cam and Tom's Canyon.
Yeah, absolutely. So just really quickly, can everybody see my screen? It's always a little nerve-wracking when sharing a screen on a Zoom. So I'm going to take that as a yes, we can see the screen. Yeah, so what is a California condor? I personally love this bird so much, and I feel so fortunate to get to work with 30% of the wild population every day that I get to go to work. So what is a California condor? California condors are the largest flying land bird of North America. They have a 9.5-foot wingspan, which they use to soar large distances looking for food. Condors are vultures, so they only eat food or animals that have already died. And in this way, they are nature's cleanup crew. They help reduce the spread of disease. And I also just read an awesome article that showed that vultures help reduce carbon emissions by finding and cleaning up carcasses before they emit methane and CO2. So condors and vultures are really great for the environment. Condors are also a very social species. So it's an adaptation that vultures have evolved to find food on the landscape that occurs temporally and spatially, sporadically. And condors are also monogamous. So for the most part, they find one mate and they stick with their mate for a long period of time. But like most monogamous species, that doesn't always happen on the long term. Sometimes there's separations, recouplings, a lot of drama in the condor world. Condors are also long-lived species. Like we said earlier, we think that condors can live 70 years or older. Condor number 1 of the condor program is 56 years old. His name is Topa Topa, and he is still actively breeding in captivity. But unfortunately, condors in the wild tend to die before they reach the ripe old age and die of natural causes. And with them dying so early, unfortunately, like a lot of vulture species worldwide, condors are critically endangered. So historically, condors actually ranged along the western part of North America, from British Columbia and all the way down to Baja, California. But by 1953, when the first condor survey was conducted, it was estimated that there were already as few as 200 individuals in the wild. And by 1965, the condor range shrunk to this horseshoe area in California, which is very similar to what the condor range is in California today. So many things actually led to the decline of the condor population. In the 1800s, there was the gold rush. People started to settle on the west coast of the United States, and along with that, people wanted to get rid of apex predators for their safety and for their livestock safety. So people would set out poison-laced bait, which these apex predators like wolves and bears would come and feed on. And with the loss of these predators, condors no longer had a source of food. So bears and wolves would kill some prey, and then condors would get to eat their leftovers. But unfortunately, condors also ate those poison-laced bait as well. And so those two ways hit condors. There was also a lot of egg and feather collecting for museum specimen, and all of these pressures combined just really hit the condor population hard, and the population couldn't keep up. So by the 1980s, the condor population plummeted to just 22 individuals in the world. And by 1987, biologists really wanted to save the species and captured all remaining birds in the wild and brought them into captivity for a captive breeding program. And
that's incredible, right?
Yeah.
Like that had really never been done with a wide-ranging bird like this. And to think that we were down to the birds that we can see on the screen basically here
Exactly.
was the entire population. Like there was no other population anywhere else, right?
Yep, that was it. And so at this point, the condor was extinct in the wild. So there were 0 wild condors back then. But thanks to the captive breeding program, we have started to release condors back into the wild out of release sites in California, Arizona, and Baja California. And there is now, this is an outdated map, but there is now a release site up in Northern California, co-managed by the Park Service and the Yurok tribe. So
Can you just describe that picture? What's happening in that picture for people who might not notice, even because it's a really great job of mimicking, the real thing.
Yeah. So in this map, we have the little dots represent release sites. So in Central California, there are 3 release sites, 2 that are managed by Ventana Wildlife Society, 1 that is managed by Pinnacles National Park. And these birds range throughout Monterey, San Luis Obispo, and San Benito counties, from Big Sur and then inland at Pinnacles National Park, and they make up the Central California flock. There are 2 release sites down in Southern California that Nadya and I help manage and monitor. So there are release sites at Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge down here and Bitter Creek National Wildlife Refuge. And our flock ranges from Ventura, Santa Barbara counties up to Kern and Tulare counties. There is an experimental release site down in Baja California. And then there's an experimental release site in the Vermilion Hills in Arizona, and those birds go up to Utah as well. And then earlier this year, like I said, the Yurok tribe and the Redwood National and State Parks created a release site and released their first 4 birds up in Northern California. And so these areas are where the birds range. And for the Northern California site, this is where we are expecting birds to hopefully expand their range as well.
That's great. And that picture to the left, that's a puppet, right? That's a hand in a puppet feeding that young live condor, right?
Yes, exactly. So back when the breeding program was first started, a lot of every single chick was so important to the recovery of the species. And the keepers actually discovered that if you take a condor egg from a nesting pair to incubate in an incubator, and then you can actually get the nesting pair to lay another egg, and this is called double clutching. And so the keepers would let one chick get raised by the adults, and then they would raise the other chick with a puppet. And they use the puppet so that the condors don't get imprinted on on humans, and don't habituate human to human care and everything. So
great. Thanks for just sharing that, because I think that at first glance people may not even realize that's a puppet in that picture, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, exactly. Great. So yeah, so now we have we've started releasing birds in California, Arizona, Baja California, and now in Northern California. But there are still threats to the condors today. The main threat to adult survival is lead poisoning from the inadvertent ingestion of spent ammunition. So like I said earlier, condors are scavengers and they only eat animals that have already died. But sometimes those animals have been shot and sometimes they're shot with lead bullets. And so lead is a soft metal and it doesn't have any beneficial purposes to life as we know it. And so sometimes when those bullets hit an animal, and especially when it hits bone, it breaks up into a bunch of small pieces, which condors and other wildlife then consume and can get sick from. And then another threat, and especially for chicks, is the ingestion of microtrash. So adult condors will feed their chicks little pieces of glass or metal or bottle caps. And we think that what they're doing is mistaking these small pieces of trash for pieces of bone or shell, which they would give their chicks to supplement their diet for calcium. So being carrion feeders, there's not a lot of calcium that naturally occurs in their diet. So when their chicks are growing and need calcium for their feather and bones to grow, we think that the adults are feeding them this microtrash instead of shell and bone. And so that gets impacted in the chicks' crops, and then they unfortunately starve to death. It's not as big of an issue today, thankfully, due to our partnerships with other organizations and microtrash site cleanups. So we've been making a lot of progress through there, but there are still threats to condor survival today. And because of that, condors are still heavily managed and monitored. We use radio telemetry, GPS to keep track of birds. We trap birds twice a year to change out those radio and GPS transmitters and do health checks and check them for lead exposure. We manage nests, and that is changing over time. But like I said, one of the main threats to chick survival is microtrash ingestion. So we still manage nests in the wild. We do some behavior modifications. So we put mock power lines near our flight pens that give birds a small shock so that they don't land on power lines in the wild, because condors have such large wingspans, they can actually electrocute themselves on a power line. So we do some behavior modification. And then of course we do captive breeding and we don't do captive breeding, but we release captive bred individuals. And we actually just released our first 2 captive bred individuals this year, yesterday. So
wow, congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. They're doing really great. They've already fed with some other wild individuals. So we're really excited. But yeah, we released our first 2 and we'll be releasing 4 more in the next few weeks. So stay tuned for photos of our new wild birds.
Awesome.
Yeah, and thanks to with all of these efforts, the wild population has gone from just 22 individuals to now about 330 birds in the wild.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
What a cool outcome.
Yeah, and that's just a little bit more than how many participants we have on this call today. So I think I saw there are like 250, and so we have 100 more birds in the wild than there are participants on this call.
I mean, maybe some of those condors are calling in right now and listening too, maybe.
Yeah, they're tuning in with their little radio transmitter.
That's right.
And so this is the overall condor population over time. This light blue, I'm sorry, it's a small graph. The light blue line is total condors, both in the wild and captivity, and there are 529 birds in total, and like I said, 334 in the wild. this is how many of those birds are captive bred and hatched, and then this is how many total wild hatched birds we have. And I'm really sorry, I did not note how many of those there were.
You can get an idea from what it looks like there.
Yeah, and then this is our Southern California population and how it's grown through time. The dark green is captive released birds, and every year we have a little bit more wild fledged birds comprising our total flock. So right now we have 91 birds in our flock, not including our 1160, the Tom's Canyon chick. So hopefully in November, the 1160 will fledge and we'll be able to add that bird to our wild population number. And that's it. And so this is a photo from Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge. We've got a condor flying in the back at the top, and then the Channel Islands in the back. So that just to give people a little reference for where we're at.
That's spectacular. I think that's a place where everybody would enjoy being at. And speaking of, since you mentioned 1160, this might be a good opportunity to kind of switch gears and focus in a little bit more on 1160. And before we do that, I just wanted to throw a poll up for the audience. I was interested, we were talking about it, it's like, how many people have even seen a condor? And since I know some of you haven't even necessarily watched the live Condor Cam, we're giving 4 choices. You can click as many of them as you'd like. But you know, if you've seen one live in the wild, if you've seen one maybe in captivity at a zoo, if you've watched one of the Condor Cams that's out, you know, there's a couple of them that are out there, or if you've never seen one, maybe you don't live in a place where that's a possibility, or you didn't know that there was a Condor Cam out there. So we'll give this just a couple seconds here because I don't want to use a lot of our time, but it's always fun to get a sense of, you know, gosh, you know, I wonder what people's lives, how they even overlap. Because when I was a kid, definitely very hard to see a condor with only a couple dozen of them in existence. It would take a real quest. Cool. So I'm gonna give you guys about 5 more seconds if you want to join into this poll.
And Charles, just as kind of a fun fact, I know that Arianna talked about how we got to a low of 22 individuals in the wild back in 1982. One of our colleagues from Fish and Wildlife Service took the photo that's behind me, and there's actually 22 condors pictured in this photo. So it's also kind of a nice, also from Hopper, you know, just kind of the other direction than the photo that Arianna had. So, you know, just kind of thinking about visually, this is how many birds were in the wild at one point before that action from when they were listed in 67 necessitated their being pulled into captivity.
That's incredible. Well, and it's cool to see the other view from the other side there. So sharing these results back out, thanks to everybody who participated. About half of you have watched one of the cams that's out there. A third of you, 76, you've seen a California condor in the wild. That's incredible and it's awesome. About 40% of you have seen a California condor in captivity, and 20% of you haven't even watched one of these cams. So if you like what you're hearing about condors, want to learn more about them, there are a few different California Condor Cams, of which we run one. You can look it up, just search for Cornell Condor Cam, California Condor Cams, and you'll come up. But it's a fun thing. We're getting to the time of year though where it's a little bit harder to see them in the nesting cavity. So that's a good opportunity to switch gears and talk maybe with Nadya just a little bit about 1160 and 1160 right now. What does that even refer to? Could you clue people into what we mean even by 1160?
Yeah, so every condor is, you know, as Arianna mentioned, is pretty heavily managed. And so at this point, we're managing them at the individual level basis. And so every condor is given a stud book number, which is actually very similar to every animal in captivity in zoological organizations. So you can kind of think of stud book numbers as akin to a social security number. Everyone is unique, everyone is discrete, and they're given chronologically. So the larger the number is, the younger the bird is, and they're given in order of when an egg hatches. So they're not given to every egg that it's laid, they're given to every egg that hatches. And so you might see gaps, and that's just because those individuals are unfortunately no longer with us. And so when you kind of see a range of different numbers, that's generally what that means. And so when we say 1160, it just means it's the 1,160th egg that we know of that has hatched and that we've kept track of.
Holy moly. That's incredible. Just the number of eggs. Again, thinking of this coming from 22 individuals, even if you're double clutching, if you're lucky for some of those 22 to be a female, which we haven't even talked about the sex ratios in those 22, right? Every condor we have today has come from management of that initial 22 genomes, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah, and it's a really big shout out to the captive institutions because these are a long-lived history, again, as Arianna mentioned, and they don't reach sexual maturity until they're about 5 or 6, and they only lay one egg every other year. And so this phenomenon of being able to get them to lay 2, even 3 eggs, Topa has actually been known to have sired 3 eggs in a single season. Just exponentially, increases that number, and that's really what we want. We kind of want to get the condors out there so they can, hopefully get to a point where their population stabilizes in the wild, because a lot of the effects that we're seeing that's affecting their population might be affecting them as a, threatened, critically endangered population or even recovering population. But hopefully at a stabilized population, some of these kind of effects that we see over time will still allow them to be self-sustaining.
That's really exciting to hope for in the coming years. We've gotten a lot of questions about what's it like to handle a condor and how do you even catch them? And just recently 1160 was handled, right? The fledgling or the nestling this year.
Yeah, and it's different. Actually, it's kind of funny because at the zoo we typically had a lot of adult birds, and just recently we've started to get some juveniles in, and it's been interesting talking to the keepers about their experiences because it kind of mimics my own experiences with these birds. Adult birds, I mean, it's just incredible to to be near these birds, let alone handle them. And as Arianna mentioned, we do these biannual trapping events that we assist U.S. Fish and Wildlife with, and to handle these kind of big birds, it's incredible. And they always have their eye on you. And, with the adults, they kind of know what they're doing. With juveniles, they're just really scrappy. And, they're going to be on their back. They're going to be using their feet a lot more. They're kind of like toddlers in a little bit of a way. And so, handling, getting an adult bird through the trapping season, we do put out bait. We do, kind of use a double door trap that's set out in the wild to, bring them into kind of a trapping space that's baited, and then open a door to get them into a flight pen space. But when it comes to actually going into a nest, you're hiking out there, you're rappelling down to these cliff sides. In Southern California, the nest cavities are cliff sides, which is a little bit different than some of the Central California cavities. But it takes, rope experts. We both have rope experts on our team with the zoo and with Fish and Wildlife Service. We collaborate into a nest entry team, which is actually one prong of a nest guarding program that the zoo has collaborated in developing with Fish and Wildlife Service over the last 15 years. And then actually getting into there, getting the chick, I mean, it's like wrestling a live,
well, I think
butterball turkey.
And I think we have a video of a nest entry that we were gonna play here. If Ben can cue that up. Because we have questions about how do you get on these cliffs, what's it take to get down there, and since both of you have participated in this, I think if you want to talk about a little bit of what's happening here, we also have questions about what the tags, like how they are attached and some things which we can get. I think we have some pictures of that in a little bit as well. But I would imagine this is a scene that most people would never get to see, right? You guys where are you right now? Roughly, not exactly, but you can just sort of set the scene.
Yeah, so we're at the top of one of our nests. We call it Hopper Canyon, and this nest in particular is one of the most brutal approaches to the nest that we have. So we have to go down into a canyon, go back up a canyon, rappel down a canyon, hike back up to the top of where we were at the beginning of this, and then rappel down to the actual nest site, which you saw Dave do in this video. So this is another footage of this one's a short rappel, which is nice. Not too sheer of a cliff, but below the nest, it's pretty sheer, really high up. So you got to have nerves of steel to be in this position. And then what's happening now is we go into the nest, we sift the nest for micro trash. And in this particular instance, the chick was actually below the nest. So sometimes it's easy, the chick is in the nest, you can kind of corner it and get it into this little canvas bag, which we use to weigh the chick and kind of keep it wrangled up. Its little foot got got loose there, so we're tucking it safely back in. So we're weighing the chick so we can get a general sense of its health. This chick was nice and healthy. 1160 during its 120 day was 16 and a half pounds, which is good. And then what's happening now is Joseph, who was in my position previously, is putting a sock, a little children's sock over the chick's head. We call that a hood, and it just helps keep the chick a little bit more calm. And so he passed the chick off to me, and we give it some oxygen to help it not stress out too much and exert too much energy while it's in hand, and keep it nice and calm. We give it a West Nile virus vaccine, which is what Dave just did. And then we use a metal detector wand and see what's in their crop. So this chick actually had a bottle cap that we could feel in its crop. And at this stage, we're not too worried about the bottle cap. This chick is a healthy bird, it's growing, and at this stage of its life, it can regurgitate. So we know that we can't get rid of every single bottle cap or every bit of trash that is out in the wild in the world. And so at some point we have to take a step back and see how well the birds can exist and combat any ill effects of microtrash ingestion. And this bird was totally fine. From there, we measure.
Sorry, I was just saying most of the impacts that we were seeing were at 90 days. And so the fact that this chick was 120 days made it just overall less likely that they was going to experience that impaction.
Yes, thank you. And Nadya has a lot more experience with the nest guarding program and dealing with microtrash, having worked on in this area a lot longer than me. So she can feel free, she'll pipe in and she has a lot more knowledge of this area. And then after that, we measure its tail feathers, make sure they're growing at an appropriate weight, and then we give the bird a tag. And we actually pierce the condor's wing kind of in what we consider its elbow. And there's just like a little, it's just like an ear piercing. So there's a little flap of skin, and we just use a needle that is hollow to pierce the condor's wing and put a tag and VHF transmitter, and then screw it on tight, not too tight so that it's not actually like putting any pressure on the wing or anything like that, but so that we can identify it and monitor the chick as it fledges and goes out into the world. So that's how we tag the birds in the nest. And like Nadya said, working up birds and handling birds is different depending on where you are, but it's definitely your heart's racing when you're in a nest cavity that has a big big drop off, and the chicks they're big at this point, but they're still fairly vulnerable. And when you're thinking about it, you're like, this is one of 300 birds in the wild. I need to do everything I can to make sure it's safe and that you don't mess up, you don't fall off the cliff.
Yeah, there's so many ways to do it wrong, right? It's really impressive that everybody is able to stay so focused that it remains a positive part of the program, and you can't tell these birds apart without taking blood or looking at their genetics in terms of sex. Is that correct?
No, and To a certain degree, that's actually pretty true. You know, if you're just looking at an individual, it's pretty hard to tell without you know, getting the wing tag, without getting that blood to be able to sex the individual. If you have a bird in hand, especially an adult, sometimes there's just kind of minor characteristics that are slightly different. You know, you ask people that have been handling condors for a really long time, and you know, they'll tell you, oh, the head feels kind of small, this is probably a female, or the beak feels a little bit thin, this is probably female, or this is a really hefty individual. There was a nest that I went to a couple of years ago, and this bird was huge. The feet were enormous, and our average 120 weight is around 16.5 pounds, which is, again, 1160 is perfect. This guy was pushing 18, I think just past 18 pounds, and everybody was convinced it was a male. Lo and behold, it was. But yeah, they're pretty sexually monomorphic.
You'd think after 2 years of doing Zooming, you'd realize when you're muted, right? And then figure out how to automatically do that. And so this is that image that was just up there. That was an image of a bird standing there post getting its tag. You know, it's looking a little bit forlorn if I had to give an emotion to it there. And so 1160 just got its 120-day health check. And you mentioned health looks good. We'll probably get a general report from you guys in a little bit. And the sex of the bird, we still don't know. Is that correct?
Yeah, we sent the blood to San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, where they do the genetics. So they'll do a parentage and sexing of the chick. And so we're still awaiting results from that. Sometimes it can be really quick, but depending on how many samples they're looking at, sometimes it can take a few months. So we'll definitely report back as soon as we find out, and make sure that its parents truly are 462 and 846.
That's right.
Yeah, I was about to say, you know, it's funny because you might not think that we would need to determine parentage in chicks, because we have a pretty good idea of the sire and the dam, or the mom and the dad, and we know who raised them. But we were actually, we got a little shock ourselves in 2020 in our Pole Canyon pair, 262 and 563. 563 seemed to be pretty loyal to 262, but there was a male just over the hill, literally just over the hill, 326, who ended up being the father of that chick.
Oh my.
And it shocked everybody. So yes, monogamous. I kind of like to say that condors are monogamous, just like people are.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good way to put it. Well, so we talked about on that great introduction about how few condors there were that are basically the foundation for this. You know, basically we're an order of magnitude plus over what that starting group was, and we have lots of people asking right now during this conversation about genetics and like, wait a second, how is not everybody inbred? And we were just talking about needing to look at the genetics to figure out their sex, and actually that even these social cues we're observing on cam or in the field may or may not be good indicators of who the parents actually are, which you said is sort of like monogamy and people can be. Would either of you care to just sort of like give a little sense of how can we not have an inbred population right now, given how small that population was that we're starting from, that bottleneck?
Well, I mean, we work with Fish and Wildlife Service has partnered with so many organizations, and this really, you know, is a multi-organization effort. And one of the organizations that we work with is the Smithsonian, and geneticists from the Smithsonian. And so they found, originally they thought there was 14 genetic founders, and I think that it's down to 12 that they actually realized were distinct founders. And so part of the captive breeding program is to make sure that there is genetic diversity. And this is actually true amongst AZA institutions. Is you have people that watch a stud book and they make breeding recommendations to maintain that genetic diversity, and condors are no different. So as a part of an AZA captive institution breeding program, as well as some other organizations that aren't AZA that are part of this breeding institution, they maintain that genetic lineage. They get those recommendations from those geneticists. And so genetically valuable breeders are kept in captivity, and they're made sure to they're kept in captivity as breeders to ensure that those genetic lineages, those original founders, are still thriving through the diversity of the genetics within the population. If an individual is overrepresented, like the oldest bird in the wild, number 20, he was in the captive breeding program for 30 years and then was released because he was well represented within the population. So he, got his chance to be in the wild to breed on his own. We can't control what happens in the wild. We do have instances of parents and offspring mating, both dads and daughters, mothers and sons. We can't control that. However, usually the negative effects of inbreeding don't occur within one generation. It's multiple generations of inbreeding. So it's not just like a small population, you're immediately going to see these deleterious inbreeding effects. It really does take multiple generations. And the constant influx of genetically diverse captive individuals does ensure that the populations remain genetically distinct. Plus now the 4 different breeding sites can really make sure that we keep those genetics diverse.
That's a great overview and a really nice, succinct way to think about how we're still able to have these viable populations, and that there's so much time and energy. Stud book is just a place where you keep track of all the different matings, right? And AZA is American Zoological Association, maybe?
Association of Zoos and Aquariums, part of my TLAs on this one. But yeah, Association of Zoos and Aquariums.
Just wanted to make sure people had a sense of what, so they understood AZA accredited institutions and that kind of thing that you're talking about, and a really important thing. I do want to mention to our panelists here, Arianna and Nadya, we're already 45 minutes into this hour somehow. And we're, just so people know, we're about quarter of the way through the stuff we had thought we might talk about, and you guys have been asking lots of great questions that we've just been putting in. So we're gonna try and work through a couple more topics here, as well as your questions. And it just probably means we need to schedule a couple of these next year and make sure we get to the point where we make it to the end. So one thing I think we should bring up is these cameras are not just here for live streaming. They're not here because you wanted to work with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They're not there because you just wanted to live stream to the world, right? I don't know, Nadya, if you want to talk a little bit about the cameras, and we could maybe look at a couple images of what it takes to set these things up.
Yeah.
Because I think that's something that for the people who do watch the cam, and for the people who maybe didn't realize there was a cam, it's actually in a pretty, if you think about the kind of country you're working in, when you're doing these nest entries, that's the same place you have to somehow create a network out of nothing.
It's true. And there are days when I'm hauling nest entry equipment out there that I wish I was working with barn owls. That was a nice roadside that you could just drive up to and get all the equipment out there. But Charles, actually, I'm glad that you said that, because while we've been streaming live to the public through our fantastic relationship with the Cornell Labs of Ornithology bird cams, this is actually the 10th year that we have had streaming cameras going on. So we actually put our first live streaming camera into a nest in South Potrero in 2012. And that technology, that idea had been a long time in coming, but a couple of years before that, or the year before that, there was a chick in a nest that just was pretty lethargic, ultimately needed evacuation, and ultimately didn't make it. But, there was, a lot of passion to understand what was happening, because while we were doing in-field observations, we couldn't be there all the time. We couldn't go back through the recorded footage. We couldn't see if the chick was being fed and, if it was exhibiting signs, if it was ingesting microtrash. We just didn't have the manpower, even though we were doing 40 hours of observations when we first started these behavioral observations. We're doing 40 hours a week. We still weren't catching everything. And so in 2012, we put these live stream cameras in so that we could really get not only an understanding of condor nesting behavior, which, in an critically endangered species, there's not much known about it. And we wanted to know more about it so that we could help inform on the grounds management decisions. In Southern California in particular, the recovered population had a much lower nesting success than the other release sites. So, historically, we were finding that nest success was about 40% on average, and Arizona in their recovered population was around that mark. But in Southern California, 1 out of 17 nests fledged without human intervention.
Oh my goodness.
A second one fledged, but required a lot of intervention. So we were looking at, on average, 10% success. And that's really what prompted the zoo and the Fish and Wildlife Service kind of step up in our relationship. We had been a part of the recovery program kind of as volunteers, but then we collaborated in this really intensive nest guarding effort. And the live cams were just a second part of that. We use that for education. We use that for management decisions. And then bird cams reached out, or we reached out to bird cams. I think it was a little bit of a both. And we realized what a great opportunity because, really the next step was outreach. The number one factor affecting condors, as Arianna mentioned, is the use of the ingestion of spent lead ammunition. And so getting the word out about how amazing condors are and how what individuals can do to save this awesome population, again, was that next step effort, is that outreach portion of it. And I think condors are pretty darn cute. I think they're adorable. I think they're silly. I think they're social. I think once you really learn about them, you fall in love with them. And what better way to do that than to watch a fluffy little nestling inside a nest cam? Now, it's not easy. We're talking about hundreds of pounds of equipment. I mean, we're talking about setting up repeater sites on these remote hilltops. We're talking about deep cycle rechargeable marine batteries. We're talking about huge solar panels. We're talking about posts and masts that you need to use a post pounder and climb out, again, these hillsides that are going up and up and up and down, up and down. You're talking about hundreds of feet of conduit. Just this camera alone, we're talking about, I guess, to get to the Western Foundation where we stream to you guys, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 jumps. So 5 different repeater sites just for that camera alone. We're over 20 cameras that we've put into nests over the past 10 years. And so, we move repeater sites around. We try to not leave equipment out there unless it's being actively used. But yes, I mean, we work in all sorts of conditions too. If a camera goes down, we try to get out there. We drive 2 hours to get out to these sites and hike, another half hour to make sure that these cameras can stay online. So a lot goes into it, but we've gotten so much out of it at the same time. I mean, we've learned so much about nesting behavior that we've actually been able to scale back some of the management, some of the entries, some of the potential stress situations that at first were warranted and needed, but we're able to scale that back because of these live streaming cameras, and we're able to reach millions of viewers and tell people around the world the story of the condor. And that's what we're here for. We want to make you think that condors are cute too.
That's awesome. And I always love seeing those pictures. I got to go out there when we initially started working together to try and get some of this equipment in place. And it was pretty impressive walking and carrying and setting up repeater sites, the batteries, the solar panels. And I'm always impressed that it works as well as it does. And there's like a 35-mile jump from Hopper Mountain down to Ventura, or maybe it's 35K, I can't remember. But this is serious stuff going on. And it's really fun to be working with, people out there studying it to try and, help more people get to watch it. Which is pretty neat. So we're sitting here at about 7 minutes before the hour right now. And I think one thing that we haven't really touched on that would be worth trying to wrap up here at the end. We've talked a lot about condor recovery. We've talked about that there's a whole, program with lots of partners, lots of different organizations, tons of people working on it. How close, what does it mean to, we talked about sort of these ups and downs and things still kind of like trending up and being self-sustaining. What is it going to mean for the recovery program to succeed? I don't know if Arianna, you might be a good person to take this question. And I don't know if there's actually a shared definition among all these institutions, but I would imagine the Fish and Wildlife Service is certainly a leading institution in this recovery process.
Yeah, so the goal of the recovery program and the condor recovery plan is downlisting the condor from endangered to threatened. And our criteria for downlisting is to have 2 wild, geographically distinct populations that have at least 150 individuals, 15 breeding pairs, with genetic makeup from the 14 founding birds, and be self-sustaining, and then have another captive population as like a reservoir population and backup. So essentially where we're at is we are pretty much close to the numbers part. You know, we have 90 birds in our flock, and then another 90 in Central California, and then Arizona has around 90 birds as well. So numbers wise, we're very close. It's really just the self-sustaining part that we're missing. Our populations are still heavily reliant on releasing captive bred individuals to make up for losses, mostly due to lead poisoning. And so really, if we can just remove lead from the environment, we think we'd be there. And so I think that's one thing that I think about often with this species, is that it's a goal that can be very much attained. It's not many other endangered species are facing huge problems like global climate change, habitat loss and destruction, invasive species, but this condors are really just hammered by lead poisoning. And it's something that if we can just get buy-in from the public, you know, I think we can really recover this species and not be doomed with such larger, bigger things. So that's something that I think about often. But yeah, we're close. We're close.
And I guess from that angle, you know, lead obviously comes through loud and clear as being the most dominant thing keeping these populations from being sustainable. More broadly, we have a lot of people who probably don't live in Southern California, or in the California Condor's range right now, who are probably listening to this or are going to watch this recording in the future. Are there ways that either of you would suggest are ways that people could make a difference, kind of no matter where they might be? Obviously in California, there might be something you can do. And what if you're not in California or in the range of condors?
Yeah, certainly just by sitting in here and learning about the California condor and showing enthusiasm for this species, is you're showing up and doing work, just educating yourselves. And we really appreciate that. Something else is learning more about non-lead ammunition, and, you know, learning about its benefits for not just condors, but for the whole entire ecosystem and many other wildlife species as well.
Yeah, I mean, I echo Arianna. You know, lead ammunition isn't something that affects just condors. In fact, lead isn't something that just affects condors. We've removed lead from our paint. We know that lead affects humans, but we also know that it affects everything else. Condors aren't particularly sensitive to lead. They actually are fairly resilient. We just, you know, had a bird that showed no clinical symptoms of lead poisoning, and the lead numbers, the blood lead numbers were hundreds, and, you know, the acceptable level for humans is 0. So I think by, you know, learning more about being able to make switches and what alternatives are out there, you know, if you use ammunition, you know, or if you know somebody who does use ammunition, if you know somebody who hunts, if you know somebody who's a rancher, you know somebody who, you know, recreates, let them know that making the switch is good for everybody, because, you know, condors may just be one species that are affected and they're critically endangered, so they're highlighted, but making it a ubiquitous sentiment that non-lead is really the best alternative out there, you can make an impact for conservation and the impact of critically endangered species, but also these other species, and making sure that they don't get to that point as well. And if there is a national or worldwide sentiment that that's just the case going forward, then we won't have to deal with these types of issues for any species in the future.
Well, that's a powerful way to end this hour together. I realized everybody who submitted questions, there's lots of questions we weren't able to answer. And I appreciate you spending the time to put your words in there. Like I said, maybe next season we'll be able to schedule a couple of these. But there is a lot of information on all of our web pages. You can go to allaboutbirds.org/condors, and that'll lead you to pretty much anywhere you might want to find information about both Santa Barbara Zoo, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a lot of the other partners that help make the recovery project or the recovery program happen. There's also this new camera we didn't even get a chance to really go into detail on, but there's something called the Cross Canyon camera that was just put up a couple weeks, well, maybe it's more than a couple weeks now, but it gives you a shot across the canyon to the nest cavity. So now that the chick's starting to range around, it's a distant view, but you get to watch birds fly in every once in a while and see where the chick is exploring. So I encourage everybody to take a look at that, or to look at any of the highlights we have posted on our YouTube channel. Again, really appreciate Nadya, Arianna, you guys showing up in the midst of a busy day. It's your lunchtime right now, hopefully, and you've earned it. Go out there and look for that carrion, make it a good lunch. And I just really appreciate you spending the time to help people learn about condors today and about all the great work you guys are doing. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Charles and Ben and everybody at BirdCams, and thank you to the 200 plus participants that came up. It was really nice to chat condors.
Exactly. I can talk condors all day, so.
I could listen all day. It's been really fun. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody in the audience. We hope to see you again. Hope to see you online. Hope you see some condors, and hope you have a great day. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.